Good morning, adventurers. My name is Ben, and welcome to a morning show where I sit around, drink some tea, and talk about D&D. All right, so first up today for T&D, I have my cozy sweater mug thing because it is a little bit chilly outside, and so the sweater feels appropriate. Now, inside of that, we have this lemon and echinacea tea from Bigelow. You might be asking yourself, Ben, you know you're going to come sit down and talk to the internet for a while here. And while, not a crazy amount of people watch this show, it will live on the internet forever. You just pronouncing things wrong and looking like a dingus. Why wouldn't you just look it up right before you started recording? And to you, I say, you don't come here to listen to me pronounce words right. You come here to listen to me talk about Dungeons and Dragons. And that's a fact. But anyway, getting into what we are actually talking about today. A little bit of context for this one. One of my lovely players started watching Dimension 20 recently. She started with Fantasy High, which is very exciting. I obviously love Dimension 20. And she texted me after, I believe, the first episode and said, Ben, what is an opposed skill check, and why don't we do any of them? And so I thought that was a great springboard. It got me to thinking and explaining to her, obviously, what they are, what exactly they are, how they work, and why I don't necessarily use them as much, for a couple of different reasons. So we're going to kind of just sort of roll through and talk about these couple of different ways to do to resolve skills and checks and stuff like that in 5e. So let's get into it, shall we? First up, we're going to talk about what a raw skill check is, right? Just a straight up skill check. An ability check would be rolling a d20, adding your ability modifier. It's just a flat out ability check. A skill check is rolling a d20 and adding your skill modifier. Obviously, that is the difference there, pretty much. And so we are looking more specifically at skill checks, but in particular, I guess the opposed ones do count or can include the ability checks as well. It's not necessarily just skill checks, but I'm going to be using them probably interchangeably, but more likely trending towards skill check, just for the purposes of keeping myself on track, because I get stuck on words a lot, which is why it's great that I, do this show where I talk for like 20 minutes at a time every single day. Okay, so let's quick here define an opposed skill check for anybody that doesn't know what one is. Obviously, no shame in that. It's just part of D&D. It's one of those things that you pick up as you go through playing and running and stuff like that. So an opposed skill check is when you make a check against, or when, I guess not necessarily you, when a creature makes a skill check against another creature. This is an opposed skill check because they are both going to be rolling. It's different than an attack roll or a saving throw or something like that, where there is one side rolling to inflict something upon the other one. In this case, it is both sides rolling to see if one side inflicts something on the other one or not, generally speaking. I say inflict in it's a very loose inflict, because honestly, it's kind of all over the place. Common ones are perception versus stealth. So a character who's trying to hide would roll stealth, and a character who's trying to see them would roll perception. Insight versus persuasion or deception or something like that. A character who's trying to discern the motive of a certain creature would make an insight check, and the opposing creature would make a deception or persuasion or whatever kind of check it would be. Honestly, kind of depends on, the... God, I can't think of the word. What the situation, there we go, is. So, those are a couple of them. The other one that comes up a lot, and honestly a lot more often, and I usually just don't call it an opposed skill check because of the way that it is framed in the rule set, are grapple checks, which are part of combat, and a lot of times opposed skill checks are not necessarily part of combat. They are plenty enough, but they also are separate from it, more specifically, while grappling is explicitly defined within the combat portion of the rules. Grappling is maybe even the most common most common example of an opposed skill check, because it is an athletics check versus an athletics or acrobatics check, or if you use some of the specialized rules that I had talked about last week, 2 weeks ago, one of those two. There are several more in there that require opposed skill checks to complete. So that is what you're getting with an opposed skill check. Now, my player had asked me, why don't we use them? My response was, we do use them. I just don't necessarily call it out as an opposed skill check every time. And quite honestly, you guys don't get yourself into as many stupid situations as the Dimension 20 crew does. You don't have quite as many stupid ideas as the Dimension 20 crew does. The group that I play with the group that I run for predominantly is mostly teachers, and so there's a lot of like prep and plan that goes into everything. So there's not quite as many like by the seat of your pants kind of snap decisions in the moment that might lead to something awful or insane happening. And so they don't necessarily run into quite as many opposed checks so much as they are all making checks individually. Or, and I talked about this in Season 1, the way that I like to do it is I like to have access to, or I like to have lists of, I have access to because they're on D&D Beyond, but I like to have lists of their skill scores, so what all their skill modifiers are. And I like to run passives a lot more because you are not stopping quite so much to just make checks to make checks. If it is a sort of vital situation, then there's a reason, obviously, for it to be a stop and roll kind of thing. Like, I'm not obviously not going to just run past a grapple with a passive check, but I'll have them roll perception if they're on watch or something like that. But if they're traveling and somebody isn't watching specifically, and they're being followed or they're being, tracked by someone who is being stealthy, then I will just run their passive perception against the person's active stealth check that they have made behind the screen or wherever, because the party is not aware that they should be doing a different skill. So they don't know that something is amiss, and so they are not going to be actively looking for something. So they aren't going to be actively utilizing a skill. So they instead, in my mind, are using whatever their passive skills are. And I use that for pretty much everything, and it helps inform some of those decisions that I make as a DM for, like, when to have people roll based on, like, does it make any sense for them to really fail in this moment? Like, the fact that rogues get reliable talent so that they can never roll below a 10 makes their passive their lowest baseline for a reason, right? Like, these are adventurers, if they have proficiency in a skill in particular, they're going to be good at it more than half the time, So I use passives a lot to sort of keep the game fluid. I run a more roleplay heavy game. Recently, they've had quite a few combat encounters, so it doesn't seem quite as much like that. But typically, our games are more roleplay heavy. And so because of that, using passives tends to create a more a fluid kind of environment. Also, it does take a little bit of the pressure off of the players to remember to do certain things. Like if they are talking to somebody and the person is trying to lie to them, and they have a party member whose passive insight is higher, but they are focused on like taking notes and listening to what the person is saying and trying to think about what their character would be doing in all of those different things in that situation, I'll just, go ahead, make a deception check, and then see who in this party has an insight that would push their passive up past whatever that deception check is. Now, if it's a 25 deception check and they don't have a passive insight over 17, they're gonna need to roll for it if they want a shot of being able to tell if that person is lying or misleading them in some way. But if they have a passive insight of 20 and the deception check is 17, then I'm going to let them know that, hey, something seems off here. You specifically, your character thinks that something is a little bit off here. If you are looking for a good example of how one of these passive things kind of run in an active game, actually, I think it's the most recent episode of Critical Role. Obviously not the one that they played yesterday, because that was not happening. But I believe the most recent episode of Critical Role in Campaign 3 had Liam's character using his passive perception because it's so high, and Matt would just stand up every once in a while and come over and talk to him. And so I definitely, I like to use passives because it allows for that fluidity, and then it does take a little bit of the pressure off of the players. Part of it, I do think, too, is that I do try to play with new players as much as possible. I like to I like to teach new players, not use new players. I like to teach new players. And so while they're juggling every other rule in the book, I like to take that little bit off of their plate for them until they get a handle on it. And then, obviously, they can ask for one of those checks at pretty much any point, and I'll let them know if it makes sense for them to make it or not. But I like to try and help them along, so to say, in that way. And that's just me. That's just something I like to do. And I gave this long answer to my player, and I finished it with a text pretty much that just said, long story short, it's a difference in DMing styles. And that's really what it comes down to. There's no right or wrong way to do it necessarily. It can be fun to get like all hyped up about an opposed check, especially if it doesn't matter at all. Or it can be good to stay in the flow of the game and not be thinking about it in character or out of character, and just use passive scores as you go forward. So that is sort of a recap of what I had talked about in Season 1 about passive scores and how I use passive scores versus how opposed scores are used. And it just comes down to personal preference. Like I said, there's no wrong way to do it. And so it really is kind of up to whoever's running the game to make that call and to use whatever kind of scores you want. If you as a player are unsure of what your DM is using, go ahead and ask them. Be like, hey, is this going to be a passive heavy game or a check heavy game? Because if it's a check heavy game, you're going to be the one that has to remember to do stuff. Also, while best laid plans never actually survive contact with the enemy, apparently heavy planning ahead of time does actually circumvent a lot of the random skill checks you're going to have to make in opposition to other people. So keep that in mind, I guess. But don't overplan, because that just eats up time then. I think that is everything that I want to talk to you guys about with regard to that. It was just something that had come up, and I thought it would be worth making an episode about and talking about. So, moving on from that to the shows we have today and this weekend. Again, plenty of shows happening. It's over the course of 3 full days, so we do have quite a few shows coming. First up, Friday, today, we have Mayhem D&D, Off the Rails, Oxventure, Just Roll With It, The Strings of Fate, Rolling with Difficulty, World of Low, and The Crowned DM. Saturday, still somehow the lightest day that I have on here, so if you know of Saturday shows, let me know, because I'd love to add them to this list. We have Dice Funk and Strange Hunters. And then finally, on Sunday, we have Super Idols, Roll for Your Life, Grinning Griffin, Dungeon Drunks, Library of Nightmares, The Chaos Brigade, Rise of the Forsaken, Chromatic Dice, The Stradcast, and High Rollers. That's a whole bunch of shows. Check out some of them. Send them some love. Let them know I sent you. It is always good to, expand your horizons a little bit past whatever the shows that you already watch are. So definitely give somebody a quick little look-see and say hey from all of us over here. But But that is everything that I have to talk to you guys about today. Thank you so much for making me part of your morning routine. I really do appreciate it. And thank you so much in particular to my patrons. You guys are the ones that make this show possible. If you're interested in becoming a patron, there is a link to my Patreon in the description of this episode. I've said it a couple times now, but I'll say it again. I am restructuring and reworking Patreon. So there's going to be some changes happening really probably by the end of the weekend here. So I'm trying to get it done before we switch over into March, because I don't want to have people pay for things that I'm not going to be following through on. That's not my bag. That's not what I want to do. So definitely, it is shifting towards being more support for this show specifically. So if you're going there for this show, then great, do that. I'm going to be moving away from as much of the homebrew stuff that I have on there, though, as much as I do love doing that. I'll post it there from time and again, but not necessarily in quite the volume that I was. But as I said, that is everything I have to talk to you guys about. So until next week, drink tea, play D&D, and keep on rolling.